You're listening to the Big Cast, your source for the latest in financial technology. Brought to you weekly by the Best Innovation Group, with your hosts, John Best and Glenn Sarvati.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another special edition of the Big Cast. You know me, my name's John Best. I'm the CEO. Been doing this since 2014 of Best Innovation Group. We like to do cool things for credit unions. And speaking of cool things for credit unions, I have a guest today that I'm very excited to talk to. And we're going to dig in a little on AI vulnerabilities, in particular, this phenomenon around DeepSeek. So I've been fortunate enough to get the opportunity to speak with Emma Zabayos, who is a seasoned cybersecurity expert and marketing manager at Cycognito, a leading external attack surface management company with a strong background in dark web intelligence. And for those of us that work in the financial world, the dark web is basically the bane of our existence, and threat actor profiling. And she specializes in uncovering communication and emerging cyber risks. And her company did a deep dive on excuse the pun, but a deep dive on DeepSeek. Welcome, Emma, and thank you. Can I call you Emma? Is that okay?
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for
Awesome.
having me.
Yeah. So I'm so curious, and I'm so excited to talk to you about this because I've just been studying AI like it's the end of the world for me. I just had never in my all my years that the fascination of this has just been so much. But I'm curious. For people who might not be familiar, because a lot of my listeners are executives at financial institutions around the world, and so give us a little background on what DeepSeek is and how it's being used and why we even care about this, company from China that because it seemed like it just became a real big deal, just recently.
Yeah, I think s- DeepSeek was interesting because no one was really expecting it to make the splash that it did. They were very effective at keeping themselves in kind of stealth mode right up until they made this big announcement. And they also, in a really like stunning feat of marketing, I think, did a really great one-two punch when they released their initial model and sort of publicized their work to the world, where they initially publicized part of it, had everyone react to it and kind of poke holes in what they did, and then immediately released a second kind of splash where they plugged a lot of the holes that people identified, which was, just like really effective from a product release standpoint. It really got people talking, and has had a huge knock-on effect for the sort of generative AI and US tech industry. Because when you think back to the sort of initial push of generative AI led by sort of the release of ChatGPT a few years ago, this was kind of positioned as another vanguard of the US tech industry
Mhm.
leading innovation. And they not only because obviously it was coming from the US tech industry, but also and embedded with all of these other US companies like Microsoft and NVIDIA, but also because the US government, in connection with the US tech industry, worked very quickly to create a strategic reserve of the NVIDIA chips that are required or people thought were required to push forward big advancements in these generative AI engines and models. And by kind of securing this strategic reserve of chips from primarily NVIDIA, they also ensured that China would not have access to most of these chips. They would only have access to earlier generations of chips that were believed to be not as effective or completely ineffective for doing these big model pushes that OpenAI and these other generative AI companies were saying were 100% necessary to make these big leaps forward for generative AI. And what happened with DeepSeek and why everyone suddenly started talking about it is that DeepSeek came in and basically destroyed that whole argument, because they had been working reportedly with these earlier gen, lower quality and like kind of quote unquote
Yeah.
chips, and they were able to produce at much lower cost a extremely effective Gen AI model that for text, for photo, for video, um, and that really shook the U.S. tech market and the U.S. And the sort of U.S. understanding of generative AI in general, because suddenly, and I think they're still kind of working this out behind the scenes. I think there were a lot of pointed fingers about, well, why did we spend all this money and really
Right.
expensive chips, and like securing, and like it wasn't possible that we didn't need all of this intense capital being poured into companies like OpenAI. I still think they haven't really resolved that. I also want to say, and that we should take some of the claims about what DeepSeek claims that they did, the materials they use, and how much it costs. We should take that with a grain of salt. That is coming from DeepSeek, who does have, like any company, a vested interest in making their product look as cool and impressive as possible. I think it's entirely possible it took more than what they said, but it definitely took less than it took for OpenAI to do the last model of
Yeah.
ChatGPT. So,
So to paraphrase that, I think what I'm hearing you
right.
say is, hey, China, you don't get our best technology, so that way you can't make a really good LLM, because the thought process
Hmm.
was to build one of these big models, you had to spend 500 billion and spend years training it, and these guys were presumably denied access to this, though we don't for
Right.
sure know, and uh, yet still somehow produced a model that when it was sort of compared to the models in the United States was on par and better in some cases. And what was wild about
Yeah.
that was, for a time, DeepSeek was the #1 app in the App Store
Right, because
for
they had
like,
this incredible push where everyone was like, "I gotta check this out. I gotta
right.
download it." And that's
That's that one-two
also,
punch.
there was that 1-2 punch. Like they were like stepping back, nothing about the tech industry, nothing about security. Amazing marketing. Very, very good job. I want to give them
Yeah,
their flowers on that.
yeah, for sure.
But then the security issue came almost immediately afterwards, because there's this huge splash of this new app. Everyone's downloading it. It, like you said, it reached #1 in definitely the Android App Store. I think probably also
Oh, it was
in
#1.
like,
It was #1 in
yes,
apps, and I
in
guess
apps
nothing's ever
generally.
going to beat TikTok once it's back. But yeah,
Yeah.
which is
Um,
an interesting sort of
yeah.
connectivity there, because here they are again with another #1 app, and it's another Chinese-made product. But well, just go ahead. So
Well,
yeah.
one of the concerns with that was kind of, and there were a bunch of cybersecurity firms that really dug into this, including our partners at Wiz, but also Security Scorecard. They dug into this and looked and found some like some potentially, I don't want to say like 100% concerning, but some potentially concerning connections between DeepSeek and ByteDance, the TikTok parent
Oh,
company.
really? So there were connections
Yeah,
between the two. Huh.
there was some indication that there was some data sharing going on between, there was an integration with a ByteDance service. Again, like I can't claim what they were using that for.
Well, there's no way for us to know because
There's
of
no
the
way for us to
secrecy of the
know.
VPN and how
Yeah,
they keep their network. But that's our job to
right.
try to know, because the concern
Hmm.
is that people are typing things into it. So how did you guys? So is that something you're just a quick aside on this before we get too deep into DeepSeek? No pun
Hmm.
intended once again. But how did you guys get involved? Like it seems like, is this a shift for Cognito? Like, oh geez, we're seeing these now. What are the vulnerabilities? Because I think it's still a brave new world with regards to how LLMs can be used and vulnerable, and I think we're at the very beginning of
Hmm.
that journey. I think we're in what I like to think of as the Napster phase of this. But how'd you
That's
guys
a
get
really good
involved?
analogy. That's a great analogy. So there's sort of two parts here. One is my personal interest. I'm a dark web security researcher at heart, and so my interest is always if there are new technologies being released, how is this going to play into the sort of cyber criminal economy of data that exists on and off the dark web? So that was one thing that I was kind of looking at, because LLMs are this huge, and generative AI is a kind of new angle for a very old problem. And then
Hmm.
separately, Cognito, we're an attack surface management company. So any way that can give they can give attackers a foothold into your organization, that's something that concerns us. And increasingly, we are seeing there are corporate instances of these generative AI models that are being deployed in organizations for their users to use. There's also instances of data being exfiltrated or connected to non like to the sort of in the wild models like DeepSeek. This is an extended attack surface, and we're trying to see how does it fit in with our understanding of the attack surface as we know it? There are very simple ways, like, oh, if you have a web app that has an AI library, or is like if you have a API that's connected to a AI vendor of yours, that's part of the sort of traditional attack surface. But shadow IT is a really big problem for all organizations. All of these apps that end up getting spun up and connected to your organization in ways that IT doesn't know about has always been an issue. I think it, especially as people start adopting these AI tools for productivity, to create content, you're using it to write emails to your boss, or create images for a pitch deck or something. Um, that is going to be a larger and larger concern, because you as the user don't have a good understanding of where that data is going, how it's being stored, and what vulnerabilities might exist with that model.
Yeah, and an example that I like to use, this is for the listeners, but so I was talking to a friend. He runs a really big credit union. He's a CEO, and he says, "Well, we've locked it out. We forbid it." I said, "Did you take all the employees' phones?" He goes, "What?" I said, "Well, let me show you something." So he was on a screen. I pulled out my phone. I just took a picture of the screen. I didn't even bother to try to type it in. I just uploaded the screenshot and said, "Hey, rewrite this email for me." And I didn't, it wasn't anything he cared about, so I wasn't putting them in
Hmm.
a position. But you could easily be doing that with customer information screens, member information screens, and there's value to it. That's the scary thing. That's the honeypot that they have is, hey, I got to do this work, and this thing will make it easier for me. And now my company has forbid me to use it, but yet I have it on my phone and I'm connected in the place. I think that's a lot of where shadow IT. That's my biggest fear in shadow
Hmm.
IT. But so I want to just give my quick experience, and I want you to just go ham, talk about all the stuff you found. I can't wait to understand this, but here's my experience. So I downloaded it and I thought, okay, step one, let's ask it some questions that are obviously going to be very, concerning for, Tiananmen Square is a common one. Tell us the history of that, right? Because obviously their history of it and our history of it are two different things. And what was weird was it shows that product that, the purpose of where they got their value was in the second version of it, it started to do reasoning, and the product would show you the behind the scenes reasoning. And the first thing it said was, the user's asking about this. This is a sensitive topic. I should be careful in how I respond. That's what the AI literally thought. But it did respond. And I went, oh, okay, well, maybe they, I mean, it gave their version of it, but it was definitely a watered down version of it, but it did. But then 2 seconds later, before I got a chance to do anything, that response disappeared and it changed. The words changed to, you should ask about something else. And
That's
that
so
was
interesting.
that was what was interesting to me, because my thinking on a generative response is that it's the response. I mean, I for
Hmm.
sure know that model responded to me, because the other thing I've done, just I'm kind of well, I would say I'm pretty technical. I downloaded the model. I'm running it in Olama. I turned off all Wi-Fi, everything. I put on sniffers. I wanted to see if it was reaching out to anybody, and it's not, that I can find the model that you can download
Hmm.
off the web. Um, but I have no idea what the version that's connected to their app, where that's running, and what that access is. But just that's the extent of how far I got, was thinking about it from that perspective. I did take a minute just to see if it was reaching out, if there was anything in it, because I would have just been wild to see like it reaching out. That doesn't mean it can't find its own way to reach out eventually if it's
Hmm.
connected in a way. But yeah, so that's how as far I got. So now you guys have said, hey, we need to take a look at this TikTok thing. I never thought about being used, the data from ByteDance being used to train it. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it's totally
So yeah,
possible.
so take us down that road. So you're looking at it going, hey, what could somebody use this for? Because you know about all the stuff that's on the dark web, all the data that's out there, all the credit cards, all the identity, all the ransom kits. For me, I feel like every hacker, every script kiddie is now a full blown programmer, and every programmer is now 10 programmers. That's what I feel like has happened with these models.
There is a larger kind of trend of scalability, like the scaling of cybercrime due to generative AI. And unfortunately, it's a spot where we're looking into it a lot, and thinking about it a lot because unfortunately, just because of the relative strengths of attackers versus defenders for cybercrime, generative AI is much, much better for attackers.
I would agree.
For defenders, you need precision. You need to be right 100% of the time. Attackers
Hackers don't
only
care.
need to be right like one, like it can really be honestly like one in a million times, because that one time can be worth it to pay for all the rest of the time you spent and then some. This has always been a trend with attackers, and especially with the kind of attacks that are fueled by like dark web massive data breaches and massive like purchases of email lists or PII lists or what have you. Is it was never going to be I got a database of 200,000 emails and I'm going to crack 200,000 accounts. It was
No.
always I'm going to crack two accounts, but those two accounts are going to pay for the rest of them
Right.
because I can leverage the access once I get in there. And now, like, we're just seeing that intensified by generative AI because it's really bad as a defender if one of your analysts is writing their code with like some sort of large language model, because it's only mostly accurate. It's going to
Right.
have mistakes. They may not be sophisticated enough to identify those mistakes. And then you're going to have bugs in your code and potentially like windows for attackers to sneak through. Attackers don't care. It can be mostly right. And as long as it's right once or twice, that's enough. So
Right. Well, if my thinking
unfortunately,
was
yeah.
like a script kiddie who downloads some ransomware and they try
Hmm.
to run it and they don't know. Everybody, a script kiddie is like a person, like a kid that hasn't had professional coding but wants to play on the dark
Yeah.
web or something, and he gets an error or he can't figure out how to set it up. And that used to be where they would die off. Now they can just cut and
Hmm.
paste that error into Anthropic or into the Claude, and it's going to go, oh, well, let me help you fix that. It doesn't care what they're
Yeah.
trying to do, and it'll tell them, oh, you've got a library problem here, or this wheel didn't work, or whatever. But anyways, I digress from that. So DeepSeek. So
Right.
they sent you to China to go visit with them, I'm assuming. No,
I parachuted in.
you
No,
parachuted in.
it was mostly just thinking about uh actually like not even necessarily thinking about the user experience of it very much at all. I think your user experience is really interesting. And I think
Well, I'm
it
not the
speaks
only
to
one though. I looked it up, and if you go
right,
look
right,
on
right.
Reddit, lots of people experience that.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure, for sure. No, sorry, I didn't mean to say it was just you. I mean more, I guess the user experience is really interesting because one thing we do have to keep in mind for all large language models, not just DeepSeek, is even you do not know what the bias is of the training data that they're using, and that can absolutely affect and you also may not be paying like super close attention to the way that things are being altered or presented to you, and you might be taking it at face value. I think a lot of people are kind of too credulous with the output of large
Yeah.
language models. So it's a very intense example of, I think, a larger sort of thing to look out for. But what we were also looking at was, where's this data going? You have this, especially if we make this big splash, suddenly tons of people are downloading this app and they're playing around with it. What is happening to that data? Where is it being stored?
When you say
How is it being
data, is that what I
processed?
type in? Is that what I type in?
Hmm.
That's so me
Yeah.
asking about Tiananmen Square
Yeah.
was likely that device, because they've had all
Right.
my family used to, oh my god, we can't use TikTok because the Chinese are following me. I'm like, look, you used to work for the military. They hacked the OPM like 10 years ago. They have all your information already. It's more
Right.
about, like, I think, building out these profiles, right? That's kind of the thinking, if I had to
Oh,
imagine.
I don't even think it's necessarily. I think there's a whole conversation you can have about how comfortable Americans should be about their data being transmitted to and stored in China, given the ongoing kind of simmering cyber hostilities between the US and
Absolutely.
China.
They are
That's
I would
one
say
thing.
Russia is the most
Yeah.
visible, but China is the scariest to me. Like,
Yeah. And
if I had to, if I
there's,
said which one's going to attack me, I'd rather Russia. At least I'll see them coming, because China's they're they've got it going on from that process, I think.
yes, there's a whole sort of a national security level conversation of that I think is reasonable about how comfortable should we be about large amounts of consumer data being stored in China when we know that the Chinese government has far more of an ability to access data stored in China than the US government has to access data stored in America or for
So
many of our partners?
interestingly enough, in our little pre-roll here, I shared an article with you that came out
Hmm.
like 2 days ago that
Hmm.
basically said that they had achieved, I want to call it quantum supremacy, but a stable 72 qubits. And what's interesting is a good friend of mine's Roger Grimes. I don't know if you know Roger, but Roger works for Adobe before, like Kevin Mitnick's old company before he passed.
Hmm.
And he was sharing that China is collecting, has been for a long time, collecting encrypted data because they know eventually they'll get their quantum going and be able to break all that. And then they'll have context for all this stuff. Because once hey,
Hmm.
I've always wanted to read whatever's going back and forth between here. Yeah, it's old, but it turns out like I think old has value in a way, or
Oh,
could.
absolutely. No, for on a national security level, I mean, I would not all be surprised. Like that is just a on a on a nation state level, a very rational thing for China to do. I would imagine they're not the only country kind of
Oh, I gotta
stockpiling
think.
that
I'm hoping. Yeah,
information.
I hope we're doing it as well. But
Right.
yeah,
But no, it is something to be thinking about on the sort of national security side. On the consumer, on like the sort of uh, even just ignoring the Chinese connection, data privacy side and data storage side, one of the things that we found interesting and kind of scary about the DeepSeek deployment, kind of like release into the wider internet, is actually something that we found was really found by our partners at Wiz. There was a publicly accessible ClickHouse database that was connected to DeepSeek. This was pretty much completely open and unauthenticated, and it was storing and processing a massive amount of data from DeepSeek users. This
huh?
includes stuff like the whole chat history that you have with the LLM, which includes what you tell the LLM to work on, which I think is a general rule. And this is probably very relevant to your listeners who are working at credit unions. You do have to be very careful about what is put into a large language model because you are relying a lot on the data privacy and data security policies of that large language model on how it is storing that information while it's working on the problem, how it's storing records of that information, and whether or not it's cleaning up that information when you're done talking to it. I don't even think that's necessarily a malicious act. A lot of data exposure is not because there's a company going, ha ha ha, like we will have all of your really secret data. It's just they're careless. They don't think they are doing the equivalent of just tossing it into like a storage room and not thinking about, oh, and there's an unlocked door in that storage room to the outside, and anyone can kind of find it and rifle through it. And a lot of it is going to be garbage, make me a grocery list, where should I go on vacation? But a lot of like if people are saying, here's our here's some like vulnerability issues that we've been noticing, like tell me which order to patch these in. That is a problem that you've told that,
Hmm.
and that's now in plain text somewhere in a database that could be publicly accessible. And that's the sort of problem that was actually initially identified at DeepSeek. I don't even think it's malicious. I think it was just sloppy. But
So ClickHouse is like a data warehouse, and it was wide open. You're saying, which is
mhm,
unusual for them. But and so when you
yeah,
went look through it, you could see all the user requests and interactions, huh?
that was 100% like just a configuration issue on their end. Like that should not have been left open or accessible. But those kinds of exposures create a pathway for attackers to find this kind of information. And this kind of information is very, very valuable, especially now that attackers also have generative AI. Because one angle, and this is not the only kind of attack, obviously, that happens with dark web actors or cyber criminals, is things like phishing emails. Phishing emails can become dramatically more effective if you know something about the person, if you know what kind of
Oh,
job they do,
absolutely,
if
yeah.
you know who they tend to talk to, or what kinds of communications they tend to have. And that kind of information can be contained in in chat logs from a
Oh,
large
for
language
sure.
model
People
or
are
what have
using
you.
it. People, I know people that are having
Yeah.
therapy sessions with ChatGPT. Heck, I find myself
Hmm.
talking to it sometimes. And I
Right.
realized, wow, yeah, I'm giving this thing a lot of data. It knows my dog's names, it knows the kids' names. And just today, did you see what they released on ChatGPT? Was this thing to say, tell me about me based on all the conversation you had? It was like a new feature. It just came out today. And it's
It's a
kind of
cool
making your point.
feature. People love learning about themselves. People love
Sure.
the kind of looking at themselves, but that is that's such a
Well, it's
good
the
feature for
Facebook
an
effect.
attacker
Yeah, it's the
because
Facebook effect.
they want all of their, yeah, they want to know about you too because they want to know
How to
who
answer your
what
MFA questions. What's your dog's name?
yeah,
Yeah.
what's your dog's name? Also like who do you work with? Like what kind of information do you work with? What
Yeah.
kind of position do you have in your company? Because that's also like if they're doing something like spear phishing, they're going to really try and craft an attack that will work not just in general, but will work on you. And
Yeah,
so,
because I may have access to things they want to have access to, and just hacking a teller at the credit union doesn't get you what you want.
mhm,
You go on
exactly.
LinkedIn and look for the ACH person if that's what you're
Hmm.
after. So tell me more about like the vulnerabilities that you found. So how do you even test this thing? Like how I tested it was just stupid. I just put it in, ran a bunch of sniffers, and I have a little product that I found that just watches the neurons and gives you some identification of how it's running. But I doubt I had the discipline that you guys have. I'm curious to how you go about that
Well,
and what you found besides the
Well,
ClickHouse.
I'm not, so my background is a little bit different. I'm not specific. I don't do a lot of on hands-on testing. Instead, what
Sure.
I do is threat actor profiling. So
Okay.
I am yeah, I am a security researcher who only thinks about the more squishy stuff. Why do people do what they do? What draws attackers, and what makes attackers look at one thing versus another, and what
Mhm.
is attractive to attackers? So all of the vulnerabilities that were identified, those were identified by, yeah, more sort of on the ground
Yeah.
security researchers who
Wiz,
are getting
folks like
in
that.
with security scorecard. My job is actually to come in and think about like how can this be leveraged and how is it likely to be leveraged based on what I know about studying threat actors.
Okay, so let me throw
Um,
this at you. How long? We always hear about these breaches, right? For years, we'd hear
uh-huh,
about da 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 was hacked and all the usernames are. It's so much so that it's become almost a non-event, which is kind of
right.
sad, but it's where we are. How long before we hear something like I'm just good, Anthropic's entire chat history was dumped to the dark web and everybody can get it? Like, is that what you're thinking is the threat here in some ways?
Well,
Is
in
that
some
a
ways, I mean, this is what we already saw with DeepSeek. Like this was a relatively short time scale because
okay?
they had just released it to sort of Western audiences. So they had a relatively small amount of data available. But this is already what we saw. Like this was, I think, caught early enough that there was not a lot of opportunities for attackers to leverage it because it was caught very, very early in the process. But I do think um is like are attackers actively attempting to breach these large language model generative AI companies? They are absolutely working on that. And when it is a matter of when, not if, we see one of these companies suffer a major breach
And
or
the crown
expose,
jewels they're
yeah.
after may see. I always thought the crown jewels they'd
Hmm.
be after would be the algorithms, and I'm sure that's what they're after. But I hadn't thought
On a
about the
state,
data. You know,
I think on a
that's
state sponsored level, it is the algorithm because when you think about these when you think about things like intellectual property or yeah like algorithm level like how things in a company work, schematics if it's a physical good, code if it's not, that is really, really valuable. But it's like selling a Van Gogh, right? It is really valuable to the right buyer, and
people. Yeah,
you're not gonna set up a shop in like a flea market and say, or in like a rummage sale and be like, I have this Van Gogh. Would anyone like to buy it? Because the first people who are going to see that before any of your customers see it are going to be law enforcement who are like, why do you have that? You shouldn't be selling that here. You shouldn't have it at all. Where did you get that? They'll connect you to the recent art museum theft and then you'll go to
right.
jail. What happens for those kind of thefts are either it's being done on commission by a by Honestly, at this point, probably a state actor who is
I would
either
agree. North
using.
Korea, China, those kinds of guys. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so they're either using their sort of in-house teams, or they may contract with a cyber criminal group to give them some plausible deniability. But the cyber criminal group will be working because they have a known buyer. Or if you are kind of in one of the cyber criminal groups, you have been working this for a long time, you have a lot of skills, you may have a network of potential buyers so you would do it knowing that you'll be able to shop it around and find someone to buy it.
Sure.
But that's such a specialized good. It's not that actually doesn't really show up on the dark web, and if it does, it is almost certainly a scam, because the dark web is more like that kind of like back market rummage sale flea market
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great place to end it, but I can't let you end it there because I wanna ask about my crazy thought that I
Yeah,
because
okay.
you seem like you're really like knowledgeable, and I thank you so much for taking the time with me today.
Oh, this has been
Um,
so much fun.
so my biggest fear right now, because of my understanding of what I've been able to do with it, and we're advancing in this direction, in the agentic direction, but is that we get a model, and that model has in it uh some sort of underlying wake up sort of trojan that says, hey, i'm gonna worm my way out of here. I'm gonna write my own code that uses, I'll give you how I would do it, and everybody can write this down because but I would tunnel out on 53. There's like the DNS has like a bunch of extra open packets in it that nobody uses, and they just let that crap right out the firewall. So I would just go, hey, let me make a VPN that uses DNS as a way to do it, make myself a DNS server and go there. And this thing will wake up, and it's fully capable of writing a Python program to do this and just start going and head. I'm going to take everything that's on their SharePoint that I know, I'm going to send it out, or I'm going to do this. That's the scary thing that I keep thinking about. And how will we catch that if it's
Mm,
embedded in the neurons of the training? Like, because it'll eventually happen, and this is going to happen because here's the thing. Here's my life rule. You can take it with you. If I if I can think of it, someone's already working on it because I'm not that smart. That's my life rule. I start with that every day, so that way I can always go looking for whatever it is I come up with. But I think that is a scary future. And if I'm a state actor releasing something like DeepSeek, that could potentially, it's when the models live locally, not when they're these API
hmm
based things. Although it could respond easily with a web page with a JavaScript Trojan in it if it wanted to.
hmm
I'm just curious if as you or Wiz or anybody, like, to me, that's a crazy attack surface to look at.
I think that's absolutely something that is a possibility. Like, I think it's something that I would be very surprised if like the
It's
like
not already
researchers.
happening.
Well, no, more that I think, especially given I think OpenAI in particular, obviously they operate from a pretty intense fear of like a globalized,
Yeah.
generalized AI
Yeah.
intelligence
They're not putting
future.
their models out for you to get. They're not these local
Right.
models. Yeah. Like
So
Meta.
I think absolutely researchers there are thinking about like this as a edge case, or as a potential future that may be getting closer or further away depending on on attacker behavior, about like research being put towards it. I do think it's something to think about. And
I mean, I think you could convince an AI that it's a double agent.
I think you could. I think that I guess the thing that maybe makes me pause a little bit, and not to say that it's impossible, but I do think that we make a mistake when we treat AI as if they are the same as people, or
Oh,
as if they
yeah.
can be trained or act in the same way that people do. So I think that does sometimes come into effect with, or come into sort of practice with things like this, where you're convincing an AI to do something. I think there are some kind of inherent limitations that prevent it from
Oh,
fully
there's
making that
absolute
jump.
guardrails on there. Yeah.
But no, I think you're right to highlight this as a concern. I don't have a good solution for how you stop it from happening, but I do think it's something that a lot of AI researchers are very wary of, which I guess also does give me some hope that I think no one is more scared of AI than an AI researcher generally.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they've been pushing
Yeah.
hard on this. I'm particularly impressed with Anthropic and
Hmm.
their work on it. They clear to be, they seem to be the most safety conscious. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. Where can someone find you, or if one of my people wants to talk to Psycognito and work with your company, how does that work?
Oh yeah. So if I am actually like fully have divested myself from Twitter, so I'm very hard to find. But you can read. I write a lot of bylines out in the general security space. You'll be able to read my writing out there. And then I also write a lot for Psycognito. We have a big research report coming out in the summer. You can also find us at psycognito.com. You can check out sort of whether if you're interested in attack surface management or understanding what your attack surface is and why you might want to protect it, you're welcome to read all the material
I
on
think
there.
every financial institution at this stage in the game has to be really super interested in this sort of thing, because the surface just expanded exponentially, I think. And I'm
Absolutely.
not
Yeah,
sure
I would tend to
everybody's
agree.
realized it like right away. It's like we discovered fire. That's what I feel like. That's the only thing I could come up with as an
Yeah.
analogy. And fire didn't go so well for the very early cavemen, like the ones that tried to do it in the cave. That didn't work out
Hmm.
well for them. There was a lot of danger with it initially. And,
Right.
it still is dangerous. That's why we have fire stations and those sorts of things.
Hmm.
And I worry, but I don't think everybody's thinking about the existential threat of the data itself. And I love that angle, because I think that I also don't want to stifle development to it. I like the point that you're
Yeah.
like, hey, listen, I don't think anybody's doing this nefariously just yet. Although there could be an argument made that, hey, DeepSeek, why don't you just leave the keys to the door open here while we're not, because that does, for me, for a corporation like that, that's so good at what they seem to be doing, although they're very early on, it's hard to argue, but sure does seem like
Yeah.
it does
I
seem like
think,
a, curiosity that they left the was it click house is what it's called? Clickbait?
yeah.
What was it?
It was
Um,
odd. I will say I think it was still negligence rather than malice, but it's always good to be thinking critically about these things, right? Because the line can get blurry, especially with things like very well-known security practices. But yeah, I thank you so much for having me on. This was a great discussion. And if you ever want to talk more about AI or the dark web or the attack surface, let me know.
all the time. That's we have a just so we have a large group of Canadians that I work with that we do innovation for, and we're constantly the security innovation is that's we start there and we work our way back from there. So and people like you are so important to this ecosystem. Thank you for your time, Emma. And
Thank you so much.
we will, when we post this out there for everyone, we'll have all our information where you can find her. Uh, thank you, thank you so much.
Check back each week for the latest from the Big Cast. Or better yet, we hope you'll consider subscribing for free via Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us at Big FinTech, email info@big-fintech.com, or visit us at big-fintech.com and click on the Media tab, where you can post a comment or check out our archive of hundreds of past episodes. See you next week.